So here we are,
Yes.
end of 3 days rehearsal, putting the whole thing together. You and me planning for a year, really, since we'd finished recording the Strigio, 40-part mass.
And you wanting to do a Vespers and me saying, no, it was a bad idea.
Did you?
I did, for a long time.
Clearly didn't listen to you and how wise I was.
Yes.
How's it sounding out there is the obvious one.
Well, it's sounding wonderful, is the obvious answer, but the great revelation for me is not the obvious things, it's how incredibly good the Viadana is. It's like Monteverdi, sort of born again, in some ways.
It's like Monteverdi, it's incredibly detailed. The detailed approach to word painting is what seems to set him off.
But also endless invention. He just never runs out of ideas, rhythmic ideas.
Yeah.
It never sort of flags.
When I first looked at it, there's always this thing that you get when you look at music on paper, that you have an intellectual response to it and you can work out what the harmonic rhythm is and you can read that, but you don't get the physical sense of it.
No, you don't.
And clearly these 4-part psalms are about the physical effect of having the 4 groups. And a lot of the time it feels like 2 groups with different colours. You've got the soloists and then you've got everything else that comes around them. And I've taken a few liberties in that I've kept the instrumental choirs, the high choir and the low choir, coming in and out, because it's the change in texture that is interesting. It's not as if he's writing for choirs 1 and 2, and then 3 and 4, and then 3 and 1, as Strigio did 50 years previously. It's rather more limited in that sense. But it's the basic movement behind it and the drama behind it is very strong. One thing that I think we've got right is the intimate conversational nature to the whole thing. The choirs talking to each other, feeding into the conversation, letting go and coming in again. And I've always felt this very strongly about this music, that it must be an intimate conversation. Yes. But if you go back to St. Mark's, Venice, in the 16th century, there is that nice letter from one of the singers saying that Signor, whoever it was, had gone absent without leave. And because he was absent without leave, there was no one to transfer the beat from organ loft 1 across to organ loft 2, because organ loft 2 couldn't see the direttore in the centre giving the beat. So, although I love this idea, and I think it's intrinsic to the music that it's sacred chamber music on a large scale, clearly in their own time, in St. Mark's, they did have issues of splitting everyone up and how the beat could be seen.
Yes, but I think you just made your own point, Robert, because what that means is that he was such a skilled passer on of the beat that it did sound like 2 intimate groups. Anybody can just be a subconductor, but this man was obviously so skilled that he could almost anticipate, and they could act like 2 intimate groups. Yep. Even it's not very wide, the choir of St. Mark's, is it?
No, it isn't. The other thing I love about that situation is that you have this chap who disappeared was called Giovanni, and then you had Giovanni Croce, who was the boss at the time, and then there was Giovanni Gabrieli up in the organ. If you call out Giovanni, yes.
But the other thing is that this intimate stuff, it's like Monteverdi psalms in many ways. There is this endless intimate stuff, but then suddenly you get the grandeur suddenly expanding on top of it. And the way you can combine the two without it being, if it still coheres, is amazing.
And that's where the composers seem to have this real physical sense of what it's going to sound like and how, with the extra octave. I mean, I've got the bass players playing down the octave. It's perfectly reasonable with an ensemble this big to have a 16-foot pitch down the octave. That's where that richness of sound really works well. So I'm sitting here looking at this Gabrieli 7-choir score, the 28 parts disappearing down the page, and important to realise that all there exists now, is this much. This much of the paper exists, all this is reconstruction. And that's one job when one of the choirs is singing the whole time. So if choir 4 goes along, choir 1 takes over, choir 2 goes along, choir 1 takes over, there's one of them singing all the time. The difficulty comes when neither of them sings, and you've just got space, and at that point, Hugh's imagination had to take over.
Well, sometimes imagination, but luckily there are these double canons, so you get diddle-diddle-yum, and you know that it has to be answered by diddle-diddle-yum, diddle-diddle-yum.
And that presumably it's answering something in one of the other choirs.
Precisely, yes, and therefore you've got it mapped out for you, quite a few bars.
There are pieces...
A lot of it, quite a large chunk of it.
Pieces of the jigsaw. Yes. But, I mean, Hugh says that as if it's easy, but that little bit, bom, 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 that's all there is. out of which you extrapolate all this feeding into it, because that's clearly the very last thing to be sung in a little echo passage.
Yes.
And then ta-da-dum, and then finally on the next page, that rather odd sui on its own, just one little voice.
But in fact, the first one you get dun da 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 second one lost, dun da 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 so choir 1 lost, choir 2, so you get the first one, not the second one, and the third one. So it gives you a guide in, a sort of template.
Yes, it's true. I think your basic concept of there being 3 capellas, 3 purely vocal choirs, as 2, we knew there was as 2, but 2 then mirrored as 4, and then mirrored as 6, and they sometimes sing exactly the same music. At that point, the music's in a texture, therefore just 20.
Yes.
Sometimes they sing different music, which makes it 28.
You can see when they sing in 4-part unison because the music is complete in itself.
Yes.
And we've heard it. There's nothing lacking there, is there at all?
What that does is explain absolutely beautiful the title, that the Magnificat was for 20/28 parts. So it sometimes is in 28 when they're all doing different things.
Yes.
Sometimes.
And there are, in fact, 2 other pieces by Gabrieli that's got exactly the same anomaly with are something else, and the something else is always 4 parts extra, meaning there were 2 capellas.
Right.
But nobody's ever added 2 and 2 together. This is always a mystery, they say.
The slightly contentious thing that you've done, which I find imaginative but right, is this fanfare in the middle. Tell us why you've put that in.
Well, it gradually became obvious to me in the 15 years I've been sort of peering at this that the whole thing was very angry and all the belligerent, warlike things in the Magnificat text are being emphasised enormously. He has shown strength with his arm, put down the mighty, sent the rich away, and all that kind of thing. And
that is something that composers tend to do.
But not to the extent of this one. It's absolutely unique in the intensity. You can feel the fury coming through.
But you've also, the Magnificat is called Magnificat. It's called the Magnificat with the as he promised to our forefathers.
Right.
In other words, he's saying we've got this refrain, as he promised to our forefathers.
Right.
Why does he do that?
Well, that refrain, as he promised to our forefathers, at the beginning of the 10th verse, but it carries on, Abraham and his seed forever. Now, if you've looked that text up, there it is in the Magnificat, quoted by the Virgin Mary. She's quoting her ancestor, Abraham. The promise from God to Abraham, the original covenant. Your seed shall be as the stars of the sky, the fishes in the sea, and then he goes on, you will be my chosen people forever. Now, when the official Judaism rejected the Messiah, according to the Christian thing, that promise was taken over by Christianity. So they were the chosen people forever.
So
but according to the Venetians, who thought that they were the protectors of Christendom, it applied particularly to them. So the promise is taken over to Venice. I will support you forever, and you'll be invincible.
So that is quite a nationalist setting of the words.
Absolutely.
So now if you add that...
But that is why, Robert, each one gets more intense. And to me, they get more and more gleeful. They're actually doing that.
So on top of this...
To our forefathers.
On top of this, at the full setting of those words, sic ut locutus est,
yes.
You have this very brass-like...
You suddenly, you have to get to you're keeping on repeating in between each verse, the capellas are repeating sic ut locutus est, but then of course you get to that verse eventually, and it's quite obvious from...
Where it's meant to come.
Yes, where it's meant to come, and it's quite obvious that it's a tutti, an enormous great tutti with this sort of tune in it.
This
and
brass like martial, trumpet-like.
Bum, 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 right. So that suggested a trumpet call to me. So add together the thing, the martial feeling of the whole thing, the trumpet-like nature of that phrase, plus the fact that there's a pause in there's a rest, half a bar's rest in all the parts, with a pause mark over each one and a double bar. And that seemed to me that something was done.
You think this relates to a Venetian victory in 1571 against the Turks?
Well, it wasn't just a Venetian victory. It was the Holy League. Pius V got together the League, Genoans, Spanish, Romans, and Venetians. But Venice turned out incredible numbers of galleys, which was one of the big things, and they'd had this terrible humiliation 2 years before that in Cyprus from the Turks, which seemed to be just the end of they killed all their officers and beheaded their leader and that kind of thing.
Once they had surrendered.
Yeah, they surrendered with a free passage, and then the Turks took them and killed them, and paraded the head of their leader around the place.
So
utter humiliation. So when they won at Lepanto, you just can't. When the ships came back to Venice 2 days after the battle, they were trailing Turkish banners and colours from the ships in triumph, and the people on the shore thought they were Turkish ships, and they began to lament. There's a wonderful account of it. And then they realised that it was the opposite, and the whole city went mad.
So these banners were paraded at this
every year, festival. Yes. Goethe saw them in 1786. He attended the Lepanto straight state procession.
Over 200 years later, they were still talking about the battle.
Oh, so they continued celebrating the battle until the fall of the Republic. Every year, a huge procession, Doge Signoria, went in a barge to the church of St. Justina, who was the local saint on whose day the battle happened, the 7th of October. But they weren't the only ones. It was being celebrated in Toledo, I suspect, to this day, every year on the date of the battle, and in Rome. I don't know whether it stopped in the other places. But anyway, putting all those things together, it seemed to me that what went in there was actual martial music, that they would play fanfares at that point as they presented banners. And it was only after I'd stuck my neck out, and you'd agreed to let me stick my neck out, and we'd put it together, that I spoke to Peter Downey, who I think is our absolute leading historical brass expert. He has done exactly the same thing in a battle mass by a composer at the same court where this music survives, a pupil of Gabrieli.
In Graz.
In Austria, yes. He had come to exactly the same conclusion. Throughout this mass, you get 2 bars rests, 4 bars rests, and it's complete. All the parts are silent.
Because that's not the sort of music.
He has put in exactly the same thing that I've done.
That's not the sort of music you would write down. You'd say to your brass players, give me one of those fanfares. Play me something for those 2 bars that would fit it.
They could do 2 sort of things. They could play those fanfares which they knew, and the other thing that we've done, as you know, is to do a sort of reminiscence of part of a piece that was written after Lepanto, was this Aria della Battaglia by Andrea Gabrieli, which is a great big...
Which itself is quoting Clément Janequin from
Absolutely, yes.
1528.
This battle piece is based on that. But you could just say to them, sort of do it, and they would sort of half do it from memory, half busk it. And so I've sort of half rewritten it
rehearsed it a couple of times and it logs in.
They were used to playing things from half memory,
especially
like jazz players.
Especially brass players.
Yes.